There's a famous ethical thought experiment called the drowning child that was invented by Australian philosopher Peter Singer in 1972, and it goes something like this. Suppose that one day you pass a shallow pond and are surprised to find a child struggling in the water. It's clear they will drown soon if no one goes in to save them. Let's imagine also that you will undoubtedly succeed in rescuing the child and come out unharmed. In short, you can save this child, and you don't have to sacrifice much to do it. So in this situation, do you have a moral obligation to save the child? Is saving the child something you should do? Is not doing so a bad thing? If your answer is yes, then imagine that there are others witnessing this child drowning, and they are equally capable of saving them as you are, but aren't doing anything to help. Given this information, are you still obligated to save the child? This thought experiment continues in other forms. What if you saved a drowning child last week? Are you still obliged to do so now? What if it's not even a drowning child, but a child on the other side of the world who's at the same risk of dying, and that you somehow have the same ability of saving? Again, without making any significant sacrifice yourself. The conclusion of this thought experiment is, if you answered yes to all of the questions, then it should follow that you are under a moral obligation to donate to an effective charity if it comes at no considerable sacrifice to you, as doing so can drastically improve, or perhaps even save, the life of a child dying of extreme poverty. The footage you've been watching was of me playing a small interactive version of this thought experiment. It has text and multiple choice answers, with branching paths depending on which choices are picked. Depending how you look at it, this interactive thought experiment can be classified as a game, or at least being like a game. The thought experiment expects you to answer yes to all its seemingly straightforward questions, and this expectation lures the player towards the epiphany at the end, towards a moral discovery. After all, few people relate the two sides of the analogy. Donating to a charity is seen as a generous, voluntary action, and never something that you should do. But if someone is in danger right in front of you, many would say you should help them. So as this thought experiment brings to light, why should it matter if we are able to see the person suffering or not? For me, no game or interactive experience provokes as much moral deliberation as this interactive thought experiment does. But that doesn't really seem like a fair assessment, does it? Sure, if you throw some literal ethical philosophy into a game, and maybe tie a simple mechanic or two in, it'll probably do a fairly good job of exploring morality in a video game format. But that doesn't mean much in terms of game design, does it? Let's hold that thought for now and visit the broader discourse around morality in games. There's one key argument that reappears time and time again when looking into morality in games. Generally, in these discussions, moral exploration can be split into two categories. These games are often praised for having an engaging exploration of morality. Many of them put players in genuine ethical dilemmas, where the boundary between good and evil is unclear, so players really have to deliberate on what the right course of action is. These games often push you into doing bad things, either because the morally righteous course of action brings some other difficulty, or because there simply isn't a purely good option, and players are left to choose the lesser evil. The games at the opposite end of the spectrum present players with clear good and evil choices, but unlike before, they don't provide any reason for players to be bad. Players are not encouraged to deliberate upon the moral choices presented in these titles, because their moral value is already clearly displayed to them. Now, there are countless YouTube videos, GDC talks, and academic papers on morality in games that have this very comparison at the core of their argument. My intention isn't to disparage these creators, but rather to raise a couple questions. What is it exactly that separates these two categories of games, and where can the discourse on morality in games progress from here? A 2009 paper by game scholar Miguel Sicart proposes a model that can help us address these questions. The model splits games into two layers, the mechanical layer and the semantic layer, which also incorporates the mechanical layer inside of it. In the mechanical layer, players are given systems to interact with, goals and objectives to reach. For instance, in Skyrim, when running through a dungeon, killing monsters and solving puzzles, players are interacting with the mechanical layer in a number of ways. They're making decisions in combat, gaining experience to level up their character, and perhaps working towards the goal of completing a quest. In the semantic layer, players consider the significance of their actions within the simulated game world and consider how their actions may affect the overall narrative. If we go back to the Skyrim example, players understand that their trek through this dungeon may be to secure the Dragonstone to help the Whiterun court wizard in his research. The main thrust of Sicart's argument is that many games present morality to players within the mechanical layer, rather than within the semantic one. Games like Infamous and Fable systematically categorize player choices as good or evil, which means the player only needs to make a mechanical gameplay decision when making a moral choice, and does not need to consider the semantic layer of the game at all. Which weapon to use in combat, and whether to be good or evil, are both decisions a player makes as a mechanical agent. Ethical agents are not required to use their ethical values as agents within the semantic layer in order to take a choice, Sicart says. It is enough to understand the arbitrary ethics assigned to a particular game state and let the game evaluate your behavior. He concludes that ethical gameplay is the product of designing the relations between the mechanical and semantic layers. This can help shed some light on what is missing from the earlier interactive thought experiment. It feels unfair to declare that it explores morality well in a video game format because it lacks a strong relationship between the mechanical and semantic layers. Singer's thought experiment is of course incredibly morally thought-provoking on its own, but adding a simple interactive element on top of it, with minimal additions, does not necessarily enhance how much the thought exercise encourages its audience to deliberate on the moral issues raised. Another game that presents many morally engaging scenarios is The Last of Us. Just like the previous example, despite the prevalence of these morally fraught situations in the semantic layer, the possibility space in the mechanical layer does not allow players to directly engage with these issues. The Last of Us does well to present morally ambivalent characters in a world that is understandably morally divisive. Joel's reactions to the adversity he faces throughout the narrative are a symbolic representation of the breakdown of society, as researcher Amy Green puts it. Furthermore, the game presents differing moral perspectives in its depiction of several antagonist groups. The federal government, who offers some safety at the sacrifice of many personal freedoms, the various gangs of hunters who lure and kill, David's group of cannibals, and the Firefly's resistance group. Whilst this exploration of morality is definitely commendable, and undoubtedly have caused many to deliberate and debate on the virtuousness of the characters and factions depicted, the game's linear cover shooter / exploration gameplay does not push the player into moral deliberation. Many will feel that this end is achieved through the game forcing the player into performing immoral actions. I would agree that in some scenes, this gameplay can be morally thought-provoking. However, as an overall package, I'd argue that in The Last of Us, the responsibility is mostly on the player to engage in any moral thinking. So, now we've separated moral exploration in games into a few categories. Games that explore morality well and push players into moral deliberation, games that explore morality well but lack a morally relevant mechanical layer that really encourages moral thought, and games that do neither of these things. In trying to uncover how games can better explore morality, the next video will move on to how games can encourage moral deliberation.